Hi there, I'm Julia Spinolo, Doctor of Nursing Practice, Reiki Master, Intuitive, and host of Medical Girl Mystical World. Come join me for Season 2 of my show where health is not just about medicine. In this season, I, along with my fabulous guests, will introduce you to different health practices, examine intriguing outlooks about life, and of course, explore unique topics like dream interpretation and astral projection to open up our minds to fascinating possibilities and to inspire you to become your best self in mind, body, spirit, and emotions. Only on the Lighter Side Network, where the everyday meets the extraordinary. I'm Dr. Julia Spinolo, and welcome to Medical Girl Mystical World. Today, my guest is Timber Hawkeye. He's a best-selling author of Buddhist Boot Camp and Faithfully Religionless. His books and the Buddhist Boot Camp podcast offer a secular and a non-sectarian approach to being at peace with the world, both within and around us, with the intention to awaken, enlighten, enrich, and inspire. Welcome to the show, Timber.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you're here. When I created the show, you were one of the first guests that popped in my head, so I'm so glad that you agreed to be here. I'm very grateful.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So let's talk about how you got into the work that you do. And I know about your background, but some of our viewers may not be familiar with you. So tell us about how you started being in the corporate world and then realizing that all of that was not cracked out what you thought it should be. So kind of give us a background on how you started in the work that you do.
I would say it was really logic that drove me to where I am. I just was trying to look at the puzzle and put the pieces together and understand not just what people do, but why we do what we do. And ultimately, every decision we make is intended to increase our happiness and reduce our suffering. Mm-hmm. And so I watched the decision that we make and I thought, well, that doesn't really add up, because a lot of the decisions we make actually make our lives more complicated, not simpler. They actually add to our suffering. We create our own suffering. And so I started thinking, where's the disconnect? How can I be happy? And it wasn't by following a recipe that I saw everyone around me do, which was by adding more things to my life that make me happy. It was by taking a time out and saying, how can I stop doing everything that makes me unhappy? Mm-hmm. How can I eliminate from my life the very causes of suffering rather than, leave everything as it is and then try to add more things on top of it? And in the book, there's a chapter called, I think it's Life is a Piece of Cake. Mm-hmm. And I wrote that chapter when I was about 14, and I had just moved from Israel to the States, and I witnessed everyone around me. If you imagine that life is a piece of cake and you're not happy with your cake, everyone kept adding stuff to their life, to their cake to make it better, right. Like chocolate frosting and whipped cream and cherries and all this stuff. But if they're not happy with their life, my 14-year-old overweight kid's mentality was, let's figure out what ingredient in the cake makes it bitter and take it out. And that way, the cake is really good in and of itself. Anything you put on top of it is icing on the cake. But mm-hmm. even without it, life is really, really good. And mm-hmm. so I would say that was kind of the first light bulb moment. And like you said, it wasn't enough to not go into the corporate world. I still followed the recipe of what I thought the quote unquote American dream was, which was, the house and the cars and the corporate title and lots of income and all of that. And it wasn't until one day after 10 years of doing that, one of the other paralegals at the law firm was celebrating her 30-year anniversary at the firm. And the fact that she was celebrating 30 years in that cubicle It just terrified me. It scared me so much, not because I knew what I wanted out of life, but in that moment, I knew what I didn't want. And that's not to say that that's not her dream come true and that there's anything wrong with that. It just didn't feel right for me. I wanted something different. And so I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew what I didn't want. And I think knowing what you don't want is an equally helpful navigation tool. It kind of rules out all these options from an overwhelming menu, and then you're left with what you get to explore and experiment with what's left. And I think treating everything in my life like an experiment was really the fuel behind it all, to take every step with curiosity instead of fear, and realize no decision short of having kids, most decisions can be undone, Right. So I sold everything I owned and I moved to Hawaii because for me, that made sense. I wanted to live a simple life. And my whole world back then revolved around beach volleyball and hiking and being outdoors and tennis. And in Hawaii, I could do it all year round. Whereas in Seattle, where I was living at the time, you wait 10 months to maybe have 2 months of summer, maybe.
Right.
So for me, Hawaii made sense. And I realized it's not about me trying to find a job where I make the most amount of money, because people think of Hawaii as the most expensive place in the world to live. It was about reducing my expenses, back to that whole cake recipe thing.
Right.
And by doing that, I realized I don't need to make more. I need to spend less. And that's the second big light bulb, is that I could just work less and live more. And that kind of became a game, like how much less, like how little can I work? And turns out that, 12, 15 hours a week was plenty. And that gave me a lot of time to do everything else I wanted to do.
How long did it take you to make that transition? Because a lot of times people will try to make that shift and we get impatient of the amount of time that it takes to get to those goals of, how long did that take you?
I hate to say it, but pretty much overnight. It wasn't, and that's why there was no, because the only thing that stops us is fear. And that's just an illusion. That's just our own voices in our head stopping us. And mind you, that's not to say, that when you want to do this, you want to do it when you're debt free. You obviously can't do it when you're still in debt, because then you're trying to climb up a mountain, but you're still tied to the bottom. That doesn't make sense. So the moment that I didn't owe anyone any money and I didn't have any money saved up, I was really back at zero. I thought it's all just an experiment. So for me, from that moment on, going to work the next day made no logical sense. It was completely irrational, because why do what I had no interest in doing? It just made, like, why would I spend my time there? I don't know how else to say it. So it was really, once the awareness kicked in, that I shifted my thought from how can I make more money? Because that's what we're kind of being told all the time, is make more, buy more. And I shifted my thought to enough. I redefined what enough looked like. I thought, well, shoot, I can do that working part-time. Why am I working full-time? So It was really almost immediate. And there was the transition of selling all this stuff and putting it on Craigslist and, packing it up. But when you're asking about the shift in the mind and whatnot, that was overnight. Like once I had my mind set on that, I'll be really honest, the law firm tried everything they could. They're like, we will double your pay. We will give you more vacation. You can dress casually. You will be the only paralegal working with only one attorney. Like, how can we get you to stay? And I said, there's nothing you can do to get me to stay, because what you're pitching to me is exactly what I'm walking away from. It's like, it's giving me more money is not going to make the 40, 50, 60-hour work week any more bearable.
Right.
It's what I'm walking away from. So it was really, and I love how the universe in hindsight always reaffirms many of my decisions, because about a year and a half later, I stayed in touch with my friends at the firm and my old boss. And it turns out that the law firm itself did away with its commercial real estate department. So my own boss lost his job. I would have lost my job had I stayed. So it was just very affirming, like, you know what, you made the right call, and every decision you made since then. And this has happened multiple times in my life. I rarely look back, but when I do, it's the universe just nodding at me going, good job. So
you got some good guides and angels with you, I would say, and a great sense of intuition for sure. Because you studied Buddhism and Zen. Now, did you study that? Were you studying that when you made that shift, or did you study it afterwards?
Way after. I think
Okay.
I was a Buddhist monk before I knew what Buddhism was. And that's what's interesting, because people would always ask me back then, what's your religion or whatnot? And I'm like, I don't know. Religion is a collection of beliefs and philosophies. And I have my own collection of beliefs and philosophies, but it's not organized,
Right.
It's timberism, if you would. And I'm very religious when it comes to that, but I didn't have a name for it. And it was really just pulling from many different schools and many different thoughts and whatnot. And I remember the first time I heard the Dalai Lama speak, he was talking about self-control, determination, and freedom from anger. By that point, 3 years prior to that, I had those words tattooed on my chest. So when I heard him speak, I'm like, who is this guy? That's my gig. And it was really intriguing to then discover so late in the game that what I had realized, early in life, even when I was as a teenager, I remember being so desperately suicidal. I was really miserable, and I blamed my mother for all of my anguish. And I spent nights, and I'm just going to be really honest, just thinking, how can I kill her and get away with it? Or how can I kill myself? Mm-hmm. And many suicide attempts later that obviously didn't work out. I remember waking up one morning and realizing, I don't have to kill my mother, and I don't have to kill myself. What needs to die is my emotional attachment to her. Mm-hmm. And so as a teenager, I cut off that emotional tie, that dependency, that need for validation from outside forces. My mother, a case in point at that stage in my life, and from that moment, when I no longer looked for her kind of approval, I was so relieved. I was so liberated, because everything I had done up until that point was just to get her stamp of approval, which she has never given anyone in the world. How could I possibly expect her to give it to me? Right. So immediately, and what I had done as a teenager without knowing anything about Buddhism is kind of what Buddhism is all about, is that there's suffering, or there's pain in the world. That's inevitable, but the suffering part, that's optional. That's something you could do something about. Yeah. And so my mother is there. That's not a problem. My emotional attachment to her, my so-called need for her approval, that was the problem. And that I actually could control. So by the time I discovered Buddhism, it was just already in line with so much of my own thinking. Yeah. Not all of it, mind you. There are many things, as I mentioned in the book too, that I first dove into the deep end of Tibetan Buddhism, and I don't know how much you know about it, but it's a very complex philosophy with very elaborate visual depictions of the teachings and the Dharma, and it's very colorful and just lots of chanting in foreign tongues, and that's actually what draws a lot of people in, but that's what actually pushed me out, because I was looking for simplicity. And I remember sitting there in front of my teacher, in front of the Tibetan Lama, and saying, with all due respect, I don't think the Buddha intended for his teachings to get this complicated. Right. And I'm really glad that he just laughed and he said, the Buddha didn't do this. The Tibetan culture did. Right. This is their way. Why don't you try Zen? And that's when I transitioned into Zen Buddhism and took off the maroon robes. And again, this story just kind of keeps going, but if it's not too late, but in short, it wasn't until way later, until I was already living this lifestyle, that I realized it's very much in line with the core of Buddhism, but not any of its one of 800 different schools. Right. Going back to something that you mentioned earlier, where we are making ourselves miserable. Now, you had a TED Talk that really focused on that. And what would be your guidance for people to change their stinky thinking, or changing how they thought? Do you know what I mean? Because
Because it's like, oh yeah, I would, but I got this, or I don't have time, or people that have excuses. If you really want to help people and inspire them, what are the things that you tell people? Do you tell them your experience, or do you give them, what kind of advice do you give them?
I really share just my own journey. And what's interesting is that it isn't mine alone. We are all battling the same things. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's intentionally that way so we can help each other out. Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right that there are a million excuses, or people say, oh, I can't help it. And I was like, of course you can. Mm-hmm. And I remember being at a time when I thought I couldn't help certain thoughts, or I couldn't help certain behavior patterns. I'm like, and I've heard people say things like, of course I'm angry, I'm Italian, or, whatever it is. And we identify with it as somewhat of reasoning, dissonance to justify how we are. And that works until the day we realize, you know what, I have this pattern of always getting angry on the freeway, or I have this pattern of always blowing up at my children, or I have this pattern of eating at 3 o'clock in the morning, mm-hmm. or at some point, we each get to a point and we say, I've developed this pattern, which means I can create a new one. And I just need to want the new one more than I want to repeat this old behavior and expect different results. So it's just like any addiction in a way. Mm-hmm. I can't want it more for someone than they want it for themselves.
Right.
And so there's nothing I can say to someone to get them to quit smoking, or to get them to quit contributing to their own suffering. Mm-hmm. They have to want it. Mm-hmm. They have to realize, I'm doing it to myself. I'm covering my own eyes and then complaining that it's dark. I can blame everyone around me, all day long. But at the end of the day, I know that it's me. I'm doing this, mm-hmm. and I want to stop. Right. And so that's the first step, and if someone comes to me at that point of, okay, after the first step of admitting they have a problem, so to speak, then they are ready to hear how me and many others have gone past it, assumed responsibility for our own present moment. And I do a lot of work with veteran support groups and the prisons, mm-hmm. and high schools and middle schools. And it's incredible because the first thing we have to drop, in a sense, is this identifying with our past, who I am. It really has nothing to do with where I've been or what I've done. It has everything to do with who I choose to become as of this moment.
Right.
And this moment and this moment. So I can redefine who I am at any moment and say, you know what, that behavior pattern, that's something I used to do. Mm-hmm. And even when I work with people who are challenged by anxiety or PTSD or whatnot, it's really important, even with our language, to stop identifying with it in the present tense. To say, I used to battle anxiety, I'm working past it. So at least it creates this momentum as opposed to our language saying things. I mentioned in the book that the big difference between saying, I am angry, which is really detrimental. It says, this is who I am. I'm identifying as angry, where in honesty, it's, I am feeling anger right now.
Right.
And that honors the feeling, and it honors the fact that it's temporary, but it doesn't identify with it. And there's a big difference.
Right.
So to answer your question in a nutshell is, watch your adjectives, watch what words you choose to use to describe your life, yourself, and the life you want. And if any of it is negative, what we think about, we bring about. We create that, yeah. we reaffirm our own darkness by identifying with it, if
right.
that makes sense.
No, it makes total sense to me. And to kind of go back what you were talking about with people making those shifts, and a lot of times it's a big shift. Like for me, when I had breast cancer, and that was my huge shift of really looking at my patterns of behavior, because during my recovery, all I had was time, and I didn't do anything. I healed, and I sat there, and I really looked at like my patterns of behavior. And then kind of like just really analyzing them. I'm like, why am I doing that? And then I realized this is my choice. I am choosing to think these thoughts and to do the things that I do. So that was, very poignant for me, but also that you mentioned that we carry so many labels with us to identify who we are. Oh, I'm divorced, or I'm a cancer survivor, or I'm I was abused. I know a woman that's in her 70s and she still brings up that she was raped at 5 years old. And, part of me thinks, okay, that's where people can relate to other people, maybe, but maybe it's also a manipulation for them to get attention. But when you redo that thing, when you retell that story, I believe it is putting a block to your growth.
And why people do it, I never, when someone does that, I don't try to analyze why they do it. I look at it and go, are there ways in which I'm still doing it?
Yeah.
It's all within me. And like you said, why am I thinking what I'm thinking? And we can go, well, my parents told me, and that's fine. That's valid. Up until the age of 18, you're off the hook. That's what you were told. That's what you know. But as soon as you are an independent thinker, as soon as one of your duties is to analyze, to reevaluate a lot of the quote unquote truths you were told and say, is it my truth?
Yeah.
Just because it's my parents' truth or the church's truth or, my cultural truth, is it mine? And because I don't have to take that on anymore. It was given to me. Thank you. And we can even be grateful for all of the gifts that we were given, all of the, church services we were taken to and all the information and say, this was useful. This was not. Thank you for this. I appreciate it. I'm going to try this. And if that works out, great. If it doesn't, I'll try something else. But with no judgment, even against it or anything, just say, yes, it happened. And I think we can even talk about, like I mentioned, the abuse in my childhood. I wrote an entire memoir about Victor. And it was so beautiful to write about it in a very similar way to telling someone what a movie I just watched was about. I had no emotional attachment to it because just like a movie, it's done. Yeah. That's I'm out of the theater. Like that portion of my life is over. I can talk about it. And I'm not there anymore. I'm not experiencing any of it anymore because I've made that distinction between a feeling and an emotion. And I felt what I felt and I feel what I feel, but I don't carry it with me. If that makes any sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I think that's what you do, your work that you do in your podcast, in your books, really brings to light the work that people need to do with themselves. And I think it's wonderful. Let's switch gears for a second. I do want to cover this in the show. I myself have done a big purge, and my husband and I have become kind of more minimalistic. And when I saw that you did this too, I wanted for you to talk about it. But you live in your RV where you sold everything to live a simpler life. So tell me how you decided to do that and how it's changed your life.
It started really with, as I mentioned earlier, kind of redefining what enough looks like. And when I moved to Hawaii, of course, I realized, working 15 hours a week was enough because I only needed to make this much. And the rest of the time I could spend studying, I could spend doing whatever I want.
Right.
And then when the book was released, I did a book tour, and it was supposed to be this short little brief visit to a few bookstores, and it ended up being 3 years across the US, UK, and Australia, during which I really just had my backpack and I was just sleeping on a different couch every night. And after 3 years, I realized, my gosh, 3 years, and I didn't need a stick of furniture. I didn't need a huge wardrobe. Everything that I needed was in my backpack. And so I realized, it's not sustainable in the long run because I didn't need a stick of furniture because I was sleeping on people's couches. But if I was to, I shy away from using that term, settle down, so to speak, where would it be? And that was a big decision in the sense that I didn't know where I wanted to be. But like I said earlier, I knew where I didn't want to be. So I ruled out any place that gets cold, because after living in Hawaii for 10 years, I'm a wuss, and I start, grabbing my jacket when it drops to 70. And So I ruled out any place that gets cold. I love climbing and hiking mountains. So I ruled out any place that's flat, and really the only things left were I needed to be near the ocean, so that ruled out places like Colorado and it was really either back to Hawaii or somewhere along the California coast. Now, Hawaii is, and this is a big distinction, taking the monastic vows in a sense is making a commitment to be in service to others. So it's kind of like I had to separate myself into, this is what Timber wants. The ego wants to play beach volleyball in Hawaii. But Timber had also made this commitment to be of service. And so I was being invited to speak. The book is required reading in 6 high schools now in California. And so I kept being invited to give talks there and at churches and yoga studios. And so going back and forth from Hawaii wouldn't have made sense. So I was settled somewhere along the California coast, but that's still a really huge area. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know where to say, okay, this is going to be home. And the RV made perfect sense because it comes fully furnished. Everything I own fits in here and then some. I often host couch surfers myself who are traveling through the Central Coast and need a place to stay. And it has everything I need. And it's directly related, when you talked about purging and getting rid of stuff, there's a direct relationship between getting rid of the tangible stuff in our lives, the extra bed sheets, the extra towels, the extra plates, whatever it is that we don't need. And even though there's no harm necessarily in those extra bed sheets being in the linen closet, there is a benefit from ridding ourselves of them. There is this, we are exercising the muscle of letting go. And if we can let go of those extra dishes, we can also then exercise that same muscle in letting go of old opinions, old beliefs, old grudges, all this stuff that we're carrying that doesn't necessarily take up room in our homes, but it does take up room in our hearts and our minds. They serve as blocks. It's like blockages that our hearts can't open that wide because we still have this, resentment towards, someone or something or this identity, all this stuff that I say, it's like a junk drawer in the kitchen. We've got to open it up and go, what can I get rid of? Because the act of getting rid of it is very liberating. Right. So that's why the RV made sense. I was in Ventura for a while. Now I'm in Morro Bay, and tomorrow, who knows? It made sense for me. And just as a side note, even financially, it made perfect sense because even if I was to say, okay, I'll be in Southern California, and even if I could, and I know I couldn't, but even if I could find a studio apartment in the basement that's cockroach infested, even that, let's say that's $1,000 a month. When it isn't, it's Southern California. It's probably $2,000. But let's just say it's $1,000. I looked at it and I was like, after, 5 years, I would have spent $60,000 to live in an apartment. And a brand new RV is $50,000. So, and it's going to last a lot longer than 5 years. And I can move it. And it's fully furnished. And I don't have loud upstairs neighbors. So it was a very logical decision to live this minimally and do this. And there are options. If people don't have $50,000, you can actually finance that $50,000. If your RV is your primary residence, the dealership will actually consider it a mortgage, and you could actually get a 20-year loan on that. I'm not suggesting people go into debt, but you know what I mean. If this is an optional lifestyle for someone, you finance that 50. It's a couple $100 a month. It's very doable. And so that's why it was a very, much like everything else, it was a very logical decision.
Right. What would you tell people that have so much emotional attachment to material things? For example, if they have their grandmother's china and...
Take a picture of it.
Yeah. That's a great
because
thing.
If your house was on fire, you're not going to run in to save that china,
right.
And that stuff, that's the sentimental. It's kind of like what I was talking about earlier with my mother. It's like the problem wasn't my mother, and it's not the china, it's the emotional attachment to it. So much so that people won't use their china. They won't even use what it's for.
Right.
And so use it. And if it breaks, that's okay. In fact, when I was getting rid of stuff, I started by getting rid of that to which I was most emotionally attached, because I knew if I could do that, everything else would be a piece of cake. So start there. And if it brings up good memories, take a picture of it. Like Google gives you unlimited space of pictures to store stuff. So just utilize that, go through it once a year, reminisce. But you know what? It takes up no room, and it frees you, it liberates you, because think about it. Then you're moving into a new apartment or a new house, but all of a sudden, oh, that house doesn't work because I can't fit my china cabinet in this dining room. I have to get a bigger china cabinet, and that we're just talking about china. I'm sure if there's someone who has that emotional attachment to that, there's maybe an old sofa that they're attached to, or, a 4-poster bed. And all of a sudden you think, you actually start believing that you need to have a huge place, but really it's none of it is serving you. It's all working against you.
Right.
So really just kind of reevaluating, do I need it or do I want it?
And how does it
would
serve
I
you?
save it if the house was on fire?
Right.
And if you wouldn't, and I'm using that as an example because recently in Ventura, there was the big California fires, and people lost their homes, and there were two very distinct responses to that. And some people were absolutely devastated and mortified, and others were like, what a great opportunity to start over. And I think if we practice letting go throughout our lives, then when we are quote unquote forced to let go, it's way more natural. And so life prepares us for this all along. Like from the time we're children, we need to let go of clothes that we really like because we outgrow them. And then our grandparents pass away. And then it's like we are constantly being reminded, don't get attached, don't get attached, don't get attached. Everything is temporary. Enjoy this present moment. Enjoy this person in your life, because a year from now, you may not be together anymore. All these life experiences are teaching us the exact same lesson. But instead of learning to hold everything very lightly and treasure every moment, the fact that everything is temporary is not depressing. It's exciting. It adds so much joy because it can all be taken away. It makes it that much more special.
Yeah.
So we pick that up along the way. Letting go of that final breath would be just as easy as opposed to clinging. I saw a quote that said, everything I've ever let go of had claw marks in it. And that's so true for so many people. So
it is.
To answer your question, take a picture of it, move on.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's I think people, they get scared of that. Again, fear. But it was getting rid of some of the stuff that I had, and it was very sentimental stuff. And, it was very cathartic letting that go. And I figured, after I stepped off that cliff, I was like, I'm going to be okay, and it doesn't change me as a person or who I am because I got rid of these things. And I think that
has a lot to do with your definition of okay. Because then you realize I was okay before, I'm okay now, and I'm going to be okay after.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't even think about it that way. Very cool. Oh, I know what I wanted to talk about being mindful of patience. And I'm guilty of this where I need to practice more patience. And you have your sit happens slogan or brand, whatever you want to call it. But tell people a little bit about that.
I mean, the reward of patience is patience. And so it's in our best interest to, I think, even put ourselves in situations where we practice it intentionally. So when we are forced, so to speak, to practice it, we are prepared. And so many people come to me and say, oh, I've tried meditation, it doesn't work, or I can't do it, or I'm doing it wrong. And the only reason people feel like they're doing it wrong is because at some point along the way, someone told them there's a quote unquote right way to do it.
Right.
And that's detrimental. And I've read those books that say you have to sit a certain way and your eyes have to be at a 45-degree angle and your tongue has to be in the roof of your mouth, and it's like, and you just breathe out in one nostril and out the other. It's ridiculous. And of course people are like, forget it, I can't do it.
Right.
And my invitation for people, especially when I do my events across the country, is always, we try to start with just sitting still for, 3 minutes. Just physically don't move. I'm not talking about try to clear your mind or empty your thoughts or anything that elaborate. Just try to sit still for 3 minutes. And if your foot falls asleep, let it.
Yeah.
In 3 minutes, rub your leg. If you have an itch in the back of your head, don't scratch it. Just wait, because most of the time it's just your mind playing tricks on you. You're trying to train your puppy, your mind, to walk beside you, but it wants to go all over the place because you've always let it. And so to all of a sudden say heel, it doesn't want to. It wants to retaliate. But if you just stay persistent and say, you know what, in 3 minutes, when the bell goes off, then I will scratch the back of my head. Then I will rub my foot. Then I will shift. But if I could just sit still for 3 minutes, the benefit of that is not those 3 minutes. It's later in the day when someone says something annoying online and you have the impulse to respond. You're like, wait a minute. I've practiced wanting to do something and holding back and just introducing a pause between impulse and action. Mm-hmm. And that's what mindfulness is. Mindfulness is just that gap between impulse and action. And that gap gets bigger the more we exercise it. And that benefit of those 3 minutes is not at the end of those 3 minutes to pat yourself on the back and say, good job, you sat still for 3 minutes. It's later when someone at work does something that upsets you, you don't blow up at them. When your child does something that you did when you were a kid, you have a pause to remind yourself, don't be mad at a 5-year-old for being a 5-year-old, And It's this beautiful exercise of just being mindful of saying, this isn't a deal breaker. This isn't, and yes, if it does upset you, if something is, and there's plenty in the world to upset you, don't get me wrong. And I'm not saying don't get angry, don't feel what you're going to feel. But I think if we introduce a pause between getting angry and responding in rage, our response will not be blinded, because rage is blinding. And if something upsets us, wonderful. That's a little trigger. That's a little warning light that goes off that says, hey, something's not right. Mm-hmm. Okay, how can I respond to it mindfully? How can I be part of the solution instead of reacting? And then I'm part of the pollution. I'm just adding fuel to the fire.
Right. So, I tell my, I do energy work, and I tell my clients, that's one of the big things. I tell them, I'm like, just pause. And they're like, well, I think I got to meditate for 3 hours. And I'm like, no, and I do the 3 minute thing. I said, you do that, and even those 3 minutes can make such a huge difference in how you go throughout the day. So I absolutely agree on that. Okay, so we are going to wrap up, but I'm starting a new thing. It's called the Fast 5 Q&A. And
oh boy.
No pressure. And I'm going to ask you 5 quick questions. You answer as quickly as you can. Don't sit there and ruminate, just whatever off the cuff at the top of your head. Okay. And my goal to do this is kind of have people get to know you a little bit better. I mean, besides the good work that you do, just a little personal peek. No embarrassing questions whatsoever. Okay, so number 1, what website do you visit most often?
YouTube.
Okay. Who inspires you to be better?
The first thing that came to mind was Eknath Iswaran. He's one of my favorite authors. And if you go to my website, there's a list of recommended books. I think it's right there at the top.
Perfect. Are you a morning person or night owl?
Morning. Really early morning.
Okay, here's a good one for you. What's your cure for hiccups?
Can't remember the last time I had them.
Oh, okay. I'll take that as the answer. And 5th one is, what language do you wish you could speak fluently?
Sign language. I took 3 semesters, and it's not speaking, but I took 3 semesters of American Sign Language, and I would love to be more, I don't know if the word fluent fits, but absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, listen, thank you so much for your time and for being on here. I'm so grateful. And continue to do the good work that you do, because it just reaches out to so many people, and we're very grateful for you.
I'm grateful. It reaches out to so many people because of the work that you guys are doing. So I really appreciate your work in the world and your audience and whatever you do. Thank you so much.
You too. Thank you. Take care. To find out more about Timber, visit BuddhistBootcamp.com. See you next time.